Hello and welcome to Ahval Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on ahvalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello, this is David Lepeska, an editor for Ahval's English language news site, bringing you the latest AhvalPod. Last week, Georgetown University's Berkeley Center published a series of articles on politics and piety in Turkey, asking a handful of analysts their view on why the level of personal Islamic devotion after 17 years under the supposedly Islamist Justice and Development Party, or AKP, in Turkey, had stayed the same or even slightly declined, and what that might mean for the country's future. Ahmet Kuru, political science professor at San Diego State University, joins us today to discuss his piece in the series. Hello, Professor.
Hello.
You argue in your piece that the corruption and oppression of this regime has left Turkey facing a moral crisis that even AKP supporters are having a hard time denying. Could you please tell me what you mean by that?
As well as I observe, AKP came to power with many promises, not only in terms of the material development of Turkey, but also in terms of uplifting Turkish public morality by limiting political corruption, at the same time to bring certain understanding of justice in their attitudes and policies. And that's why they have the name justice as part of it. And they emphasize, and Erdoğan, President Tayyip Erdoğan, was almost obsessed with emphasizing the acronym AK Parti. In Turkish, it means pure. So the purity of morality, justice, in addition to development. That was the promise. What we have observed as many analysts and several segments of society, it's almost documented that there is a certain level of bribery, corruption, that's one thing. In addition to injustices, from the Kurds to those who have been purged, and from the everyday life, what has happened to many people can be called as injustices. And the result is not only the decline of the reputation of a political party, but it is also the decline of the credibility of a movement that I would call Islamic movement in Turkey in particular, and even the right-wing political movement in general, because recently the AKP established a coalition with the nationalists right now. What the regime represents is not only the Islamist aspect of right-wing Turkish political wing movement, but also the nationalists. So almost all aspects of Turkish right has led a Turkish society and politics to a moral crisis as the main actor, and the Turkish right in particular and Islamic movement, in particular Islamic movement, has lost any credibility of making any moral claim for the future of Turkey.
What about what happened to main opposition leader Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu yesterday? On Sunday, he was attacked by AKP supporters after a funeral in Ankara. I'm guessing you saw that. Many people linked this to President Erdoğan and other AKP officials criminalizing and demonizing the opposition in the wake of the AKP losses in the March 31st local elections. This what happened yesterday seems like an example of this moral crisis you mentioned.
Unfortunately, yes. So, in French, they have a saying, plus ça change, plus que c'est la même chose. They say the more it changes, the more it becomes the same thing. Unfortunately, in Turkey, we see the repetitions of history. Therefore, whatever we see reminds us something happened before tragically. So personally, I am very sorry to heard and learn what happened to Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. I have deep respect for him because he really tried to promote justice and certain level of mutual understanding And I think the decision by him to nominate people like İmamoğlu and other candidates from the center of the Turkish political spectrum rather than some far left or staunchly assertive Kemalist candidates was a very smart move choice by Kılıçdaroğlu and an important contribution for the certain level of mutual understanding and tolerance in Turkey. So the attacks against such a peaceful person is definitely unacceptable, but it is not a single attack. It reminds me what happened after the June 2015 elections. Certain level of violence brought back a bigger electoral victory to the AKP. So now if there is such a plan, such a expectation of the regime that with more chaos and violence they could win Istanbul back, it would really be unfortunate in the long run. It also reminds me to Madımak when certain mobs in Sivas attacked Alevi intellectuals and burned a hotel and dozens of people died, unfortunately. So all sorts of bad memories are revived. And unfortunately, things are repeating itself in Turkish politics. There is very little progress and learning. That's what I see. That's what I argue. That
on that point, you argue in your piece that because Turkey is ruled by one man, President Erdoğan, who is prone to these unpredictable changes in rhetoric and policy and behaviors like this, this regime is unlikely to leave behind a legacy, an institutional framework that can grow and shape Turkish democracy. And then again, it might face these repeated events.
I agree, yes, you summarize correctly, because in the piece I briefly mentioned that after Abdülhamit, staunchly Kemalist Young Turks came to power, and then after assertive secularism, this supposedly Islamist populist regime of Erdoğan came to power, and Erdoğan regime may give birth to a new staunchly Kemalist, or not Kemalist, but a different form of staunchly secularist, assertive secularist generation. So some readers of my piece criticize it. I understand that, but I also want to remind them that when we look at from American perspective, the swinging pendulum generally, especially in terms of religion, politics, relations, get more moderated. So in the United States, we had the semi-establishment of Protestantism in the 19th century. Then pendulum swing to more secularist side. Then by Eisenhower, we have the monotheist establishment swinging pendulum back. Now Republican Democrats always pushing the pendulum, but each time it's kind of becoming more moderate. But Turkey is not like United States on this point. Turkey is like France. In the French case, after the revolution came Napoleon, and then monarchy again, and then establishment of church again. Then came the Second Republic. Then it was followed by a different monarchy. Then came the Third Republic. So unfortunately, the Turkish politics is not following a more moderation, progressive path. That's what we keep seeing, action-reaction cycle. And I think that's related to the fact that theoretical debates are so shallow in Turkey. There is very little intellectual engagement, very practical, very violent understanding of power. And on many issues, even on the issue of secularism and Islam, the academic literature is very narrow, very limited. Daily politics is not based on learning. But that's why we don't get the lesson and repeat the same mistakes again and again.
I mean, one could say that the U.S. political discourse is also very shallow these days. That's where I'm from. I'm an American. So, I mean, I don't know how that shapes Turkey so much. But it's interesting that you mentioned the French example, because that is what Erdoğan had said when he instituted this new presidential system, that it was following the French example, although it's not really.
Can you repeat again? I couldn't follow the last sentence. Yeah.
I was just saying that it's interesting that you point to the French example that Turkey is following, because Erdogan had said that this new presidential system is based on the French system, even though it's not really.
No, it's not. Yeah. So what I was trying to say on both the cases of United States and France is the long-term trend. Yes, today we have a very problematic presidency in the US, but intellectual debates and media and universities are actively producing. That's not the case in Turkey. That's one thing. And then you are right that the presidency in Turkey right now can be called neither American nor French. It's an enigmatic thing. And it's a la Turca presidency, where there is no checks and balances, and the parliament's role is very limited, kind of rubber stamping. In France, there's prime minister and president cohabitation. They coexist. That's not the case. Yeah, the presidency right now is a system designed to satisfy Erdogan's personal demands. There is no other logic behind it, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned that you say you predict in your piece that a staunchly secularist generation will emerge that will come to be the next leadership of Turkey. Are we starting to see glimpses of this new generation? Are we starting to see glimpses of a new type of generation with the emergence of Ekrem İmamoğlu, for instance, as Istanbul's new mayor? He said on Sunday that Istanbul will be a model democracy, and some people have pegged him as a future presidential candidate.
So in the piece, I ended with two possible scenarios, as you mentioned. One is a possibility of a democratic coalition broadening, and different groups will learn from their mistakes and understand each other and contribute democratization. That's the best case scenario. And Ekrem İmamoğlu and his emphasis on democratization and peaceful cohabitation is a good sign on that. But the other scenario, worst case scenario, is that the Islamist regime will not give up with elections. They will use any means in a Machiavellist manner. Therefore, they will only leave power after a total economic collapse and with certain level of hostility on the opposition. And unfortunately, the attack to Kılıçdaroğlu and the language used by the AKP media contribute my worry that the worst case scenario is more likely, that the Islamists will not give up. They think that they committed crimes which should be covered up. Therefore, they will use any means to stay in power. In the short run, they may stay in power, but in the long run, there will be reaction. So more specifically, for example, Imam Hatip schools. When Erdogan claimed that Imam Hatip schools graduates have a particular dawah not in the Arabic sense dawah, but in Turkish it means they have a case, a purpose, a goal, a specific mission. Mm-hmm. So then Turkish people can rightfully ask, what is the specific mission of 10% or so students? Why don't the 90% of students have the same mission? And if a different government comes to power, they will question the existence of these schools and regard them as potentially politicized institutions. And Diyanet also is now heavily politicized. And even several practicing Muslims I know are now very critical of the Diyanet and Imam Hatips. And if there is a secularist mood and movement against these institutions, old friends will no longer support these institutions because they are really disappointed, many people, by becoming Erdogan's proxies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you close in your piece by basically saying that a secular dictatorship is much more likely than a working together to rebuild Turkish democracy, which doesn't sound like progress. It sounds like you say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Yet again.
You are right. Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't seem progress. In fact, I did not have a celebratory tone. Anyone knows my work. I've been very critical of assertive secularism. In my book, I compare in my first book, I compare United States, France, and Turkey in terms of state policies towards religion. And I criticize both the Turkish and French policies, and I provide US model for an alternative to Turkey. But unfortunately, rather than moving from French type assertive secularism to American type passive secularism, Turkey moved to a kind of Iranian type Islamic regime without clergy. Obviously, it's not Iran. Turkey is a Sunni country, and historically, no clergy can play an executive role. But it's a populist Islamist regime with many Islamist discourses. We can't call it as American type passive secularist system right now. And the reason I think is that Islamic movement is too much pragmatic and practical. They use, for example, my work against the Kemalists, but I understand that they use as an instrument. They did not really, for example, they use European Union membership as an instrument. They use intellectuals like Ahmet Altan, Mehmet Altan as instruments. So at this point, I really don't know what AKP sincerely hold as principles, what the ideology is, what their moral principles are. That's why I argue that when Erdoğan, as a mortal human being, one day, in 1 year, 10 years, 20 years, he'll be gone. When he is gone, there will be no consistent ideology of Islamism, no institutional basis. It's a one-man rule which will end with the end of the man.
Lastly, any thoughts about what might happen with the Istanbul election result? Erdoğan shook İmamoğlu's hand yesterday or this past weekend, but at the same time, the AKP is saying that the votes of purged civil servants in Istanbul should be annulled, and therefore the vote should be redone. Do you think the tensions will recede and the AKP will accept İmamoğlu as mayor, or they will continue to rise and lead to some more difficulties?
I think it's a lose-lose case for Erdoğan. If he accepts İmamoğlu, I hope he does, and Ekrem İmamoğlu remain as the mayor of Istanbul, then Erdoğan is no longer a godlike, omnipresent, omnipowerful leader of Turkey. He has to learn to share his power. So for me, it will be good for Turkish democracy. For Erdoğan, it may be bad to share power. But if he manipulate things and somehow repeat the elections and get one of his party members elected by some tricks and some rigged elections, he will lose the legitimacy of that particular election, at least internationally and nationally. And therefore, his power and legitimacy will be harmed. And in the long run, we'll see, but I hope they will not use the purge people as an excuse, because this former civil servants who were purged from governments not with a court decision, but with a governmental decree. I am explaining for the audience. And if AKP use their voting as an excuse and cancel the election, then the presidential election should have been cancelled too. The referendum should have been cancelled too, because in those elections, the purge people voted as well. And the last thing I want to say is that voting is a right of all citizens with some limitations, of course, age and others. And if the people who are purged from civil servants are no longer having the right to vote, then how come Turkish government tax them? The government should stop asking them to pay tax.
Yeah, I mean, are they still citizens if they cannot vote? Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Kuru, for your time and insight.
Thank you so much for having me in your program and for your insightful questions.
Thanks again. Have a good evening.